There it is. All right.
Great. And I just shared my screen. Can you see my screen okay?
I sure can.
Great. So thanks for having me and thanks everybody for coming tonight. It's a great night to talk about rainwater harvesting. I can hear the rain outside my window. It's such an amazing resource that we have so much of the year in this climate. I am a co-founder of Greywater Action. We're a nonprofit and we focus on education, trying to help people transform their homes so our homes can be managing and using all of the water flowing through our homes in a better way so we can have a more sustainable water culture. So I'm happy to talk with you tonight. And before we start, as you probably know, harvesting rain is nothing new, maybe new to you and new to your community, but really our ancestors all over the world have been harvesting the rain. We've just forgotten about it temporarily for the last couple hundred years. There's, thousands-year-old cisterns, even in climates that we consider arid, where people did utilize this resource, and especially in wetter climates too. Really, all over the world, you're going to find these old examples of people looking to the rain as a great resource. And today, it is also a water supply for millions of people around the world. From in this country, Hawaii is an example where so many people only have rainwater as their water supply, to other countries around the world. So it's old, it's new, it's still being used today. And we're going to talk about how we can tap into this in our own homes in Oregon. So tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about benefits of rainwater harvesting. We're going to talk about stormwater, which is water that's kind of flowing onto streets, and it can be a big pollution problem, but we can transform that problem into a solution. We'll also talk about rain gardens and rainwater catchment systems, going over the different components and then design that you can implement in your own home. And before we get into rainwater, I just want to mention it as kind of one tool in our toolbox of transforming how we use water. It's a great resource, but it's not the only one. There's other water supplies that you may have heard about or you may be interested in researching later on. Or maybe you already use, like gray water, which is water we already used in the home, that can also be sent outside to be reused. And then there's other waters like black water that contains the toilet water. It's not typically safe to reuse in your own home, but at the community scale, we can recycle water and use that for another use. So there's lots of different sources of water that's not just the potable tap water, because we have all these ways we use water where we don't actually need to be drinking it. So the quality really can match the need that we have, be it irrigation or toilet flushing or other things like washing our clothes. And so now we'll get into the rainwater portion. And before we built our cities, when it rained, most of the rainwater soaked into the ground. Our landscapes were very spongy and they soaked up that water and it slowly went into our creeks and rivers. But when we urbanized, that really changed how water flows through our landscape. When we built roads, buildings, all these things that have what we call hardscape, like anything made out of cement or a surface that doesn't seek in water. And that really caused all the rainwater to run off very quickly and take all the pollution with it and send it right into our waterways. And so that was a huge change. It also really affects all our streams and our rivers. And so this graph, just to kind of give you a sense of what's going on with the stream flow and how we can have a beneficial impact on that. Before we urbanized, that was an orange line, when it rained like it is today, there would be an increase of water flowing into all the waterways, the rivers and streams, and it would kind of peak and then it would slowly decrease over time as the water kind of came out of the spongy environment and flowed into the rivers or creeks. And with urbanization, when we're not doing anything, to that blue line, it just spikes. So when it rains, all the water just rushes in really quickly and causes a lot of erosion and other problems, and then it's gone. And so what we can do as kind of rethinking our urban landscapes is we can control that flow and we can slow it down. So that kind of a greenish yellow line is showing what we can do when we implement these strategies, like put in rain gardens or detention basins or other things to slow down that flow of water so it doesn't go so quickly into our creeks. And that can really help with wildlife, and with our watersheds, all the things that need healthy creeks. And so just a couple of terms, if you're not familiar, I'm going to talk about stormwater and rainwater. And really, it is the same thing. It's water falling from the sky. We use the word stormwater when that water has hit the ground. So the quality is going to be different and how you can use that water is going to be different. So stormwater comes from water that's running off paths or streets or parking lots or really any other ground level surface. Rainwater, when I say rainwater, I'm going to just be talking about the water that's landed on our roofs that you can intercept before it gets to the ground. So getting it out of your gutter, for example, or your downspout, you can send that into a container and it hasn't hit the ground yet. So that's the difference between stormwater and rainwater, but it starts out just water from the sky. And so starting with stormwater causes a lot of pollution because it washes our cities clean and it washes away all the stuff we've put in onto our cities, on the roads, on the yards. So there's dog poop, there's pesticides, fertilizers, trash, brake dust, oil slicks from the streets. There's really just a whole bunch of stuff that's really not healthy for the aquatic organisms in our waterways. And so stormwater is a humongous source of pollution. And so we kind of have this double benefit. We can stop this pollution and we can get that water to be benefiting our landscapes. So the kind of big picture concept is we want to keep that water where it lands or as close to where it lands as possible. So we want to slow down the flow off properties. We want to sink it into our landscapes. And we can start by just thinking about what we're putting on our yards. These two pictures are showing landscapes that have very little runoff when it rains because they have thick wood chip mulch. So the picture on the left, the paths, instead of being a gravel path or a cement path, they're thick wood chips, and that's very spongy and can soak up a lot of water. And then there's a lot of plants around that soak up the water too. The picture on the right, most of that is wood chips too, and then there's just cement paver stones to move through that landscape. So anytime you can, when you don't actually need hardscape, if you can use a material that's going to soak up water, you're going to be slowing down rainwater or stormwater. You're going to be slowing stormwater from leaving your property and allowing it to sink in. So these are really simple things you can do. And then we'll get a little bit more involved where we're actually going to shape the land so it's more like a bowl, so it can temporarily soak up more water. And this is another word for this is called passive water harvesting. So we are harvesting the water, but we're doing it in the ground. So in this picture, you can see there's a house on the right. It has a gutter, a downspout, and it's directing that water to what's like a basin, a depression in the land that's a little bit lower. So it's kind of like a shallow bowl planted with plants. And the rainwater is going to go there and it's going to be able to be stored there temporarily as it slowly soaks into the ground. So there's not going to be runoff from that property. And there's not going to be flooding because there's a space dedicated to soak up that rainwater. We typically call these rain gardens. So you probably have seen them. Maybe you even have one. They're used in cities all the time now. Nowadays, if there's going to be new developments, rainwater is not allowed to run off anymore. You have to have some kind of management of it. So you'll often see rain gardens incorporated into, buildings and all over the place. But if your house is already built, you most likely don't have one unless you've gone and kind of retrofitted your own yard. So rain gardens, you can think about them as just a really nice garden feature. It's like a special planting area that's for the rain, and you're going to grow a lot of nice plants. When you design a rain garden, you're designing it so it's not going to need irrigation. So it's also a really nice benefit is once you've established your plants, you now have a whole section of your yard that doesn't need to be irrigated. It's going to be adapted to thrive with our typical rainfall patterns. While you're having this lovely landscape feature, you're also going to be managing the stormwater. So you're going to be cleaning that water because it's flowing through plants and soil and infiltrating it into the ground. And you're also going to be helping your community because you're keeping that water on your property, which is going to prevent flooding, downstream. So if everybody can keep the rainwater on their properties, we don't get all of this water going into the streets at one time, causing flooding issues. And so basically how it works is you direct rainwater from your home using gutters and downspouts, and you're directing it to a dedicated planting area. The plants that you pick, they're going to have deep roots, and so they're going to be opening up the soil and allowing infiltration. You have a place for the water to come in. You have a place to manage the water as it goes out. So you've really designed this rain garden to manage the water there. If too much water comes in and it can't soak it all up, you've created a way for the extra water to safely leave the rain garden and go somewhere else where it's not going to cause a problem. So it's just kind of a thoughtful way of managing some of your rainwater, some of your stormwater in your landscape. They are used all over the place in wet climates as well as drier climates. So the plants that you put in a rain garden are going to be native plants to your area, so they can be able to withstand the dry time of the year. The picture on the left, that is in, I believe it's Seattle, Rain Dog Designs. They do a lot of rain garden systems. And so those are plants that are going to thrive in that climate. The picture on the right, that is in Los Angeles. That's also a rain garden. And you'll notice there's a cactus in part of the rain garden. So the plants kind of around the edge of the rain garden, those are typically plants that can be drier, and they usually aren't very wet. And so the type of plant's really going to fit your climate, where you live, what you like, what you want to see in your yard. There's lots of flexibility in what plants are going to grow in your rain garden. So the kind of main point of a rain garden is you're irrigating native plants. So if you like to grow native plants, rain gardens are an excellent choice because they are really set up to provide water for native plants. And they're also preventing stormwater pollution. So you get that double benefit. They can be used in kind of bigger, a little bit bigger than just a home. This picture, this is, I believe it's in Tucson. This is from Brad Lancaster's website. He's got some great books about harvesting rainwater called Harvesting Rainwater for Drylands and Beyond. There's a couple of books in his series. And in this picture, you can see on the left, that was as they were doing the landscaping of this little small development. The picture on the right, that's the finished landscape. So when it's done, you don't even necessarily know that you're looking at a rain garden or that you're seeing a way that this landscape is managing the rainwater. It just looks like a really nice landscape. They're used in parking strips. So if you kind of go around town, wherever you live, you're most likely going to see these. They're very common now. Sometimes they aren't the most beautiful when they're in the parking strip or along the street, because the cities plant them with just really robust plants that don't take a lot of maintenance, but they sometimes are very lovely. So these are two different pictures from parking lots and residential streets. And they can be used on larger landscapes too. These pictures, you can see the before and after, the rendering of kind of the finished, what it's going to look like. And so these upper pictures, there's a lot of grass and not a lot of plants. So when it rains a lot, the rainwater runs off the grass landscape. It doesn't run off as much as if that were like cement, but it still runs off. There's not a lot to soak up that water. And the pictures on the bottom, you can see how the landscape has been reshaped. So it's more like a bowl down at the bottom. And there's places for that water to really soak up and be infiltrating in that area. So the soil is going to get wetter and stay wetter for longer, and as well as grow more different kinds of plants that can help infiltrate the water. At the commercial scale, so the larger scale, sometimes stormwater is not just used for for irrigation, like in the rain gardens. Sometimes it's collected and filtered and then used for non-potable uses like toilet flushing. So there are examples like that. You might see them, and that's a really great way that a commercial site can cut back on their water use. But for the residential scale, typically it's just going to be sending it to a rain garden where you're growing native plants. So with the rainwater, when we want to use that water later, the previous pictures and examples I was showing you, all of that water is just going right into that landscape. It's not being saved up to use later. Rainwater, we can also collect it and then use it later. And we typically have tons and tons of potential. This chart on the right is just showing you some rainfall averages on a typical like 2,000 square foot home. So you can see in even very dry climates, you're going to get thousands and thousands of gallons of rainwater over that year. So there's a lot of availability of rainwater, even in pretty dry climates, but it's not necessarily when you want it. For example, in Oregon, we get rainwater all winter long where we're not really needing to irrigate very much. And in the summer, when it's the hottest, we typically don't get any. And so that's when we consider storing it and using it for later. And something that I think is kind of the best to consider is how you can integrate different strategies in your home based on what options you have, where you have potential for rain gardens. Maybe you don't have a lot of landscape, just a very small amount, and so a rain garden's not going to be a good match for you. Maybe you can store it in tanks. Maybe you can do all of these different options. This image is showing a house that has a rain garden in the front. So one part of the roof is sending that water into that front rain garden, where it's slowing the flow, sinking the water down into the landscape. And then on the left, that's called catch and release. So sometimes if you have a small area where maybe you can't sink all that water in to the ground, you can have small containers like rain barrels, just like 50 gallons, maybe 100 gallons. And you can collect some of that first rain that's coming down and then slowly send it into the landscape. So that can give you a little extra capacity when you don't have a lot of area to build a bigger rain garden. And then in the back on this picture, that's showing a tank. So I'm going to talk next about how we can store up the water in tanks and then use it later. So that can be a big tank, it can be a little tank. There's a lot of different tank type options. And do you think we should stop and do questions now before I go into the collection part, if there's any about stormwater or rain gardens, or do you want to just wait till the end to do all the questions?
There are currently no questions in the Q&A, so we can just keep moving along. And yeah, folks, if anything comes to mind, feel free to put your questions in there.
Okay, great. Yeah, and we can go back at the end. We can come back and talk more about any of the questions that you might have along the way. So I'm going to move into talking about the storage part of rainwater. And so you can collect a lot of water. You usually don't have to collect all of the water from your entire roof, depending on the size of your home and access to gutters and downspouts. But you can collect a whole bunch of water. Even in 1 inch of rain on this roof, you can collect about 600 gallons. And we get a lot more than 1 inch of rain. So it's a pretty big amount. You can store it in a lot of different ways. Barrels are a really common way, like the 55-gallon barrel. This house is showing a couple of different strategies of collecting rainwater. There's a single barrel. It's pretty small. It can go pretty much anywhere. You can paint it to match your home, put it somewhere out of the way. Really, it doesn't add a big footprint. It doesn't take up too much room. You can also connect barrels together. So in this image, it's showing under that back deck, there are 8 barrels connected together, and that's about 400 gallons of storage capacity. So that can be a really nice way to use, I'll call it dead space in your house. Sometimes people have like a little strip behind a garage or under a deck, and you can connect these barrels together and get several hundreds of gallons of capacity in a pretty simple way. And usually it's pretty affordable. Then you can go to like a bigger tank, or it's called a cistern or a tank. The image on the left of that house, there's a 3,000 gallon tank, and that's near the house. It doesn't have to be. I have a 3,000 gallon tank at my house, and it's about maybe 30 feet off the house. So I'll talk a little bit later how you can position the tank where it's not right next to your house, but that's not it depends on how big your yard is, but that could be a giant tank, or maybe that could fit nicely into your landscape, depending on how much room you have. And then here in this picture, we're showing a 10,000 gallon tank located away from the house. So for homes that are really relying on rainwater, for whatever reason, maybe the groundwater is bad, or it's a place that just doesn't have a lot of access to good quality water. It's maybe salt water intrusion in the groundwater table, or whatever the reason is. People usually go for like a 10,000 gallon tank. So that's going to be pretty big, and that's usually a little bit farther away from the house. So depending on why you're collecting rainwater, and all of the parameters are going to influence what kind of tank or barrel you're going to use. So at the residential scale, the common uses for rainwater, usually people start with using it for outdoor irrigation. It can be really simple to do that. Call it low tech. You're just collecting the water. You're not going to drink it, so the quality is not super important. And you use some basic screens to keep out mosquitoes and keep out leaves and debris, and then you can just send it right into your landscape. It can be gravity flow, really simple. If you have a bigger system and maybe a bigger yard, you might want to do a drip irrigation system with your rainwater, because it can be a little time consuming to use up the water if you're out there with the hose. And these rain systems don't have a lot of pressure. So if you imagine hand watering with the hose, and then probably it's going to take like 2 to 4 times longer if you're using kind of a low pressure situation. So depending on the size of your yard, you might want to streamline that a little bit. And so you can set up a drip irrigation system with your rainwater. You can sometimes have it work with gravity if your setup allows for that. Oftentimes you might need to have a pump or something to pressurize that water. That's going to add a complication, but it is definitely a possibility. And sometimes systems will have what's called makeup water, or additional supply of water going into the system. And those are going to be a little more complicated, but they can really help with big landscapes that are using rainwater for irrigation. And then there's the indoor use of rainwater. Most common indoor use of rainwater is non-potable, so sources like toilets and laundry, where the water is not touching, people, and it's not drunk or splashing like in the shower. Water, we're not drinking it per se, but it definitely can get in people's mouths. So you don't want to have non-potable water in a shower, but in toilets and laundry, it's totally safe. And rainwater is relatively clean. It's totally clean, but then it lands on the roof. So there is some ways it can become dirty. So that's a way that people cut back on their water use. And then there's also whole house systems, like I mentioned before, where the rainwater is the water supply for the home. And so those systems are going to have other components like a pump for sure, and disinfectant and filtration. And if there's another water supply, they also might be connected in to that in a safe way to make sure there's no crossing over of the rainwater and the other water supply. So that's kind of the range. Since I don't know what all of you are thinking about or interested in, I'm going to mention some of these more, like number 3 and 4 briefly, but I'm going to focus on number 1 and 2 because that's really the most common in Oregon, because most people do have other water supplies. So one thing that you might want to do is figure out how much water you can collect on your roof. And like you saw in that kind of slide a few slides ago about averages per general cities around the country on a 2,000 square foot roof. If you're just doing this as a supplemental source, this can just be, you could totally skip this exercise, or you could just do it for the fun of it. But if you're really trying to know how much water you're saving, or if you maybe are working with a pretty small roof and you want to make sure it's going to fill up the tank that you're looking into, or definitely if this is an important part of your water supply, you're going to want to figure out how much water your home can collect, or the roof can collect that you're working with. It's pretty simple. You just have to know how wide the building is and how long the building is. So you basically find the area of the building. And if you have, some homes are not like a rectangle or a square, they are like a more L shape, then you just add these different rectangles or squares together. The example I want to share is very simple. This home is 30 feet wide, it's 80 feet long. You multiply that together and you get 2,400 square feet. And that is going to be the area of the roof. And you might notice that this roof is pitched. It's not a flat roof, and that's totally fine. That doesn't impact the amount of water collected on this roof. Just imagine the rain like falling as a sheet. It's going to hit the upper part of the roof first, and the rain that's kind of more out to the edges is going to hit later, but the same amount of water is going to hit that roof, regardless of how steep that roof is pitched. So you just have to multiply the length times the width, and now you have the area of your structure. So then that's your catchment area. So then you need to multiply it by the rainfall. Usually we do average rainfall, unless this is like your only water supply, and then you might want to consider like the worst case scenario drought. You would do this differently, but typically we do it by average rainfall wherever you live. And then you multiply it by a coefficient. It's 0.56, and that coefficient converts rainfall in inches into gallons. And it also assumes an efficiency. It assumes that not every drop of rain is going to be collected. Some of it's going to blow away, not all go through the system. So that just gives you a more realistic number of what you're going to collect. So for example, that 2,400 square foot roof, I live in Eugene, 46 inches is our average. I'm going to use that 0.56 coefficient. When I multiply all that together, I get 60,000 480 gallons per year. So it's quite a big number. I don't have enough resources to purchase a tank that big, nor need to, or space to. So I have a 3,000 gallon tank, which is totally sufficient for the needs that I am using for my rainwater system. It's supplemental irrigation. It's irrigating a whole big section of my yard, and it fit into all the parameters of my landscape. So it's kind of nice to do this number just to see like how much potential there is, and then you're gonna work with the constraints that you have based on your size of your home and your budget and all that, or the size of your yard and your budget and all those things. This can be definitely more important if you're trying to collect from a very small structure, like maybe it's a garden shed and you're in a community garden or somewhere where you don't have a big house to collect off of. And so I'm going to talk about codes and regulations, and I just want to mention that sometimes when I table or go to events, people say, I heard rainwater's illegal in Oregon. I don't know if any of you have heard this, but it definitely has kind of got out there into people's minds that rainwater might not be legal to use in Oregon. And that's actually completely false. But there was this one incident of a man who was, he basically built a gigantic pond without a permit, and it did fill up with rainwater, but he got in trouble for building this gigantic pond without a permit, though the headlines would lead people to think otherwise. So I just want to bring that up because if you've heard that, just know it's not true. This is what he did with no permit, and that's really different than collecting rainwater from your roof. So rainwater collection is totally legal in Oregon. There's no permits needed if you're doing these outdoor only systems that are gravity flow. So you don't have a pump, you're just collecting the water from your home. You're storing it in a tank. The tank is stable and it's under 5,000 gallons. So, and then you're using it in your home. If you want to do like an indoor system, like send it back inside to flush your toilets or something that's more complex, you can still do that. You just need a permit because there's, more, you need to have some oversight to make sure that you've done it safely. And there's the regulations up there if you want to look into them more. So we'll start with the simplest, the rain barrels. I'm going to go into the kind of how you would install this really simply and kind of what to look into. So with the rain barrel, they're about 50 gallons. You can connect them together, like I mentioned before. You can just connect them all at the bottom and then just have one outlet so they all fill and empty together, kind of like batteries connected together. You're going to have an inlet into your system, and you always want to screen. Anytime you're going to have water standing around, you don't want mosquitoes to get in, so you'll have screens or prevent mosquitoes from going in. You're going to have an overflow. If you're having these barrels and you're elevating them at all, you want to strap it down for safety. So even though 50 gallons is not that big, it is quite heavy, so you wouldn't want this to fall on somebody, so you always want to make sure it's stabilized. And then you have an outlet where you collect the water. That's a basic way you do it. Here's a picture. Oftentimes the barrels are blue. You can often find repurposed ones. In this picture, these are olive barrels, and the blue ones they just need to be food grade. So just kind of look, depending on what you get, you might have different colored barrels. There's black ones, there's orange ones, there's blue ones. And sometimes you can get them quite affordably, though since it's a little more popular, it's harder to get these barrels. You used to be able to get them for free or really, really cheap. And now that's a lot harder to do because more people want them. So here's the blue barrels. These ones, there's a company, I'm going to have a link to it later, and you'll definitely get all the links in the resources. But they sell little adapters that work for these blue barrels that are really standard standard adapters to get into it. And here's a system that this person put in. It's 5 of those, so that's about 250 gallons. And you can see the diverter just drilled into the downspout. There's a screen on that top. So when the water comes off the roof, it screens out leaves and debris, and then the diverter just comes right into the downspout. And the really nice thing about this kind of diverter is it's the inlet and the overflow. So if the barrels are all full, then the water just continues on how it used to go. So you don't have to make a special overflow for your system. So there's several ways to fill the rain barrel, like the picture on the left, it's just going right into the top of it. Then that thing that I'm showing you a close-up of what you saw in the last picture. This one is really nice because, again, you don't have to have the overflow. It's the inlet and overflow all together. And you just drill a little hole into your downspout and then put that on there. So it's probably the easiest one. It's flexi, and you can just, move that flexi tube into your rain barrel. And there it is. So it's not too expensive either. So anytime you have water, like you don't want mosquitoes, if you're using a larger system like a tank, sometimes these tanks fill from the top and you want to make sure that you have some kind of screen. They often come with it, but just if you're looking at, maybe you get offered or you find some kind of container that's non-standard, people adapt a lot of things to collect rainwater, just make sure that you're thinking about screens to keep out leaves and keep out mosquitoes. And so we're talking about irrigation here, and I just want to show a little bit about the quantity of water you need to make a big dent in your summer irrigation. So if you have a 100 square foot of lawn, which is quite small, you would use your rain barrel in a week pretty much. If you're doing a vegetable garden, your rain barrel would last a little more than a week. If you're using it on low water use plants, then they only need about 15 gallons. So your one rain barrel is going to last you for a couple of weeks. So looking at these numbers can guide you to thinking about, if you're wanting to use rainwater as more a source of irrigation, looking at your native plants, your low water use plants, that's going to be really beneficial to cutting down on how much water your landscape needs. And then your rainwater is going to go a lot farther. If you have a lawn and you want to stay green all summer, it's really not going to be very helpful for you because lawns use so much water. That also, these numbers might make you think, wow, maybe one rain barrel is not quite enough for me. Maybe I want more. And rain barrels can be a really great educational system. They're pretty easy to put in, and they can really give you awareness of how much potential you have with this resource because they fill up very quickly. And then also you use them really quickly, so they can really show you how much water your landscape needs. So I think it's beneficial as a tool, but if your goal is to cut back on water use, then you're going to want to do some more than just a rain barrel. So you'll probably want to get a tank of some sort, whatever kind of tank you have. These are the basic components. You're going to have your catchment surface, which is your roof. You do need to have a gutter. So if your roof doesn't have a gutter, that'll have to be part of the effort to put that in before you can collect the water off the roof. And a downspout. Screening, again, you're always going to have screening keeping out the leaves. And usually that goes just right under the downspout before you collect that water into your tank. With a big tank full of water, or actually with anything full of water, it's not empty, it's full of air. So you're going to want to make sure that things are not totally sealed tight, that air can get out. So that could actually be a vent, or it could be through your overflow, or there's different ways that you can let air out. But that's something to keep in mind, that empty things are actually full of air. So when you try to fill them up with water, if there's nowhere for the air to go, it won't fill up with water. The tanks are going to have an overflow, and they usually have a separate one because there's a lot more water flowing in and out in this system than just one barrel. And they are going to have a faucet or a valve, some kind of outlet. And then sometimes they'll have filters and pumps if you have a more complex system. So here's some pictures of barrels. The top left, that's a 1,200 gallon barrel. And those green round barrels, they're the most affordable option typically when you get into the tanks, and they're pretty common. So that's probably what you're going to be getting if you're going into a bigger size, like more than 300 gallons. And those green barrels can go from, you can find a couple hundred gallons up to, several thousands of gallons. So there are lots of different size options. The picture on the right, these are more narrow. So sometimes people have a narrow strip like along the home. So they want to connect a couple of narrow barrels together, or narrow tanks. And so each one of those is 250 gallons. So they can connect several of those together and get a pretty big amount of water in that narrow strip. And then just for size, you can see that 10,000 gallon tank. This is on a rural property, so space is not really an issue. And you can see there's a person standing in front and there's a person on the ladder. So that's a pretty big tank. And those are usually made out of metal, though not always. And so when you have your tank, you need to get the water from the house, the roof, to the tank. And there's two ways to do it. I'll call one a wet system and the other's a dry system. So in a wet system, you have the water going through your gutter downspout into, and you put into a tube, a pipe, that's the word I was looking for. You put it into a pipe, and that pipe can come all the way to the ground, and it can go across the ground, and then it can go back up and into your tank. And as long as the top of the tank where you come in is lower than the gutter where you're going down from, as long as there's a difference, the water is going to flow through it. But there'll always be water in the bottom. That's why it's called a wet system. So if you get heavy freezes, if that's not buried, you might need to have a drain in that system. But that's a really nice way to get the tank away from your house. So you're not stuck with the tank right by the house or really close to the house. Like in the bottom image, that's a dry system. You can see how the water is going to flow through that pipe and drop into the tank, and there won't be any standing water in that pipe. So that works really well if your tank is right next to your house, or sometimes people have like a little kind of cover awning or something going over, and they can run the pipe along with it. But it's often impractical, and you really just go down to the ground and go across the ground and go back up. And that way you can have a lot more flexibility of where you locate that tank. So here's a couple of pictures of the parts. There's that screen. With this one, you can see an example of crossing over. Maybe there's hardscape right along the house, so you can cross over an arbor or something, or you could cut a little strip out of your hardscape if you needed to, and then going along the ground up into the tank. So just a little more on keeping the rainwater clean. It's very clean when it comes through the sky, and then it lands on your roof and flows through all the different parts of your roof, your gutters, and your downspout. And so you want to start by keeping the screen right out of the downspout. So that's going to keep away the big stuff. And then there's a roof called a first flush. This is something I'll show you in the next slide. So that's getting out the kind of dirtiest water, the water that's washing off the roof. So if you imagine all summer long, there's like dust and debris getting on the roof, bird poop. And then that first rain, when it's kind of basically washing your roof, that's the dirtiest water. So you don't want to send that right into your tank. You want to divert that water away and then fill up your tank after the roof has already been washed. You also want to make sure your tanks are, they don't let UV sunlight through, because you don't want algae to grow in your tank. So they're typically a dark color, or if you happen to get a lighter colored tank, you can paint it just to make sure that UV light isn't getting in and causing algae to grow. So there's a picture of that leaf screen. You're going from the gutter to your leaf screen. There's various options. You've probably seen those really pretty rain chains. You can incorporate those into your rain system. There's different ways to do it. So the first flush diverter, this is where you don't want to collect that dirty washing of the roof. If your system is pretty small, you don't really need it. You can just physically turn, not connect your pipe the first time and send it into the tank after. Or if you get a little consistent rain all along, it's kind of optional. But in our climate, it is nice to have that to divert the first flush away. Though the first flush diverter does require a little bit of maintenance. It does have to be clean. So if you're the kind of person that you're not going to really do that, clean out that diverter, then it's better just to skip it altogether, because it won't work unless it's kind of cleaned out on occasion. So how it works is the water is flowing. So we'll look at the middle picture, the middle, and as well as the one on the right. These are just two variations of where you locate it. But basically the water is flowing, it fills up that tube, that big tube along the house, or the big tube in front of the tank. And inside that, there is a floating ball. And that floating ball, when it gets to the top, it plugs up right in that T. So it plugs that off, and then the cleaner rainwater flows and fills the tank. And the first flush diverter kind of drips itself, it empties itself. And so the next time there's going to be a rain event, it will fill it again. So it kind of empties itself. And that's the place that does need a little bit of maintenance, because you'll have to kind of clean that out. It does get slimy and gunks up, and eventually doesn't clean it. Doesn't itself, so you have to do that, but it's pretty minimal amount of work. So we've collected the rainwater and now we're going to use the rainwater. You can use it with a hose, watering can, or a gravity fed drip system. Usually you'll do that for a larger system. And if you do drip, there's several options. You just need to make sure you are using a low pressure drip system, because the rainwater tank, even though it's pretty tall, there is some pressure. It's not the same amount of pressure as like a tap or a regular, city water pressure. So you have to use drip irrigation components that can be used with very low pressure, or you go into a more complex system like having a pump that would then need a permit and could use any type of drip irrigation. So your overflow, going to be the same size as your inlet. So when your rain tank fills, water can safely flow out, and you want to send your overflow somewhere like a rain garden or a planted area or somewhere that can soak up the extra water that flows through your rain system. Indoor, all of it's going to be the same until you get to the filtration. And so there's always going to be a pump and a filter, and you can use it for toilet flushing. There's so many examples of indoor rainwater systems all around Oregon, California, all over the country. There's just a lot of them. Here's one where I live. It's a big, indoor collection tank, and it's using for irrigation and toilet flushing as well as laundry. Here's a potable system. This is on Lopez Island. The San Juan Islands have a lot of homes that don't have good quality groundwater, and so they rely completely on rainwater. So it's quite common to have potable systems in Washington in this area. If you're doing an indoor system, you're going to need to get a permit, like I mentioned before, and you'll have to have drawings and a designer. So it is a little more complex, but you can definitely do it. There's examples all over. You would just need to provide the permitting agency a little bit more info. So this is an example from a permit for an indoor rainwater system. And again, rainwater is used, big buildings, there's so many different examples of rainwater being used all over the place. So for cost, the lowest cost are going to be these repurposed barrels, do-it-yourself projects. When you're purchasing a tank, you're looking at 50 cents to $1 per gallon about. So that'll get you in the ballpark of how much you're going to spend. And then if you're hiring somebody for a more complex system, the dollars per gallon goes up to about, $1.50, $2, $3 per gallon. So there's a huge range of costs, and you can, pick a type of rainwater system that's going to match into your budget. So wrapping up, and I know we can get to questions in just a sec. When you're thinking about using rainwater, the first question to ask yourself is, what are you going to use the water for? If you want to grow native plants or just have a lovely, native landscape, a rain garden is going to work really well for you. If you want to use like a rainwater for a vegetable garden or plants that are going to need irrigation all summer long, that's when you want to think about the tank, storing up the rainwater for later on. So really thinking about what are you going to grow and what type of system is going to match that. Then think about where you can locate your system. So looking at your home, look where the gutters and downspouts go. You can always change them, but that's a lot of extra work. So if you can work with your existing house, that's going to make your system a lot easier. So look at the different options of where the downspouts are, or think about, could you redirect, the downspout? You pipe it along your house, turn a corner, you can make some small adjustments relatively easily, but think about where the tank could go, and also where do you need to use the water? So how do you get the water to the part of your landscape where you need it? Thinking about how you're going to direct the water into your system. Can you use a dry system, like going straight into your tank, or a wet system where you're going to go along the ground? Or if it's a rain garden, how can you, have that pipe connect your downspout into the rain garden? And don't forget to use your screens and manage the overflow of the water, where it's going to go after it fills up whatever you've created. So I'll stop with at the resource page, and you're going to get an email with all that. So I'm not going to, really go over these. Just there's a bunch of websites where you can get some online materials, and there's resources from the Soil and Water Conservation District that are more locally targeted to what you would need where you live. And I think that is the end. So I'm going to stop there and see about questions.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was really interesting. We've got a couple questions. Oh, a lot of questions just came in, so this is great. I'm just going to work my way through. And this first one, you touched on it a little bit by talking about screens, but our first question asks about if you're collecting rainwater in a barrel from the winter, come summertime, is there any concern about that water staying fresh?
Yeah, if you're screening the system, the rainwater will be really high quality for irrigation. It'll be fine. And you most likely are going to use it up that year, so you don't need to store it multiple years, but it's really fine quality.
I saw you had when you were you were mentioning the different types of materials that you can make a rain barrel out of. You had metal, and then in parentheses with a liner. Does that liner have to do with preventing some kind of interaction between the metal and the water?
Yeah, most metal rainwater tanks are going to have some kind of liner because of rusting. You don't want the tank to rust and then get holes in it. I wouldn't say like always, because there's stainless steel and there's variations, but the most common ones are going to have a liner to prevent rusting. And
Cool. All right. Well, so then the next question asks, can you tell us more about stackable skinny storage for catching rain off your roof, and where to find them?
yeah, there's a couple of models they're called slimline tanks, and that's kind of like a style of tank. The cost is a little more because to engine, like a round tank is it's very stable. So it doesn't have to be as thick as when you try to, hold water in this more narrow, like a shape. So the cost is a little bit more, but they are available. There's even, I don't know if they're still available, but they even used to make ones that were like a rectangle that were actually completely flat. They were called rain hogs, but I haven't seen them for a while, so they might not be available anymore. But yeah, look for
that branding.
Yeah, maybe. Look for a slimline tank.
Excellent. Okay, this next question is about that equation that you use to calculate how much water your roof could collect. And they ask, do you have to factor in any sort of evaporation element to that equation?
If it's just for like supplemental water, I would say no, that's totally sufficient, that equation. But if it's like your only source of water, then you get a lot more picky with that equation. You look at the worst case scenario drought, and you might be a little more conservative of how much water you're going to collect. But if you're just doing this for supplemental water, that's totally sufficient. That it's a 90% efficiency. I mean, if you feel better, you could get your system a little bigger, whatever makes you feel like it's the right system for you. But yeah, no, you don't have to worry about that.
Fun fact is we actually have a rainwater calculator on our website. Yeah.
Nice.
So if you're not really into math and you felt a little intimidated by that equation, don't worry about it, because in that email that I send after this, I'll have a link to that calculator to do this for you.
Great.
The next question, are there experts who set these up? Seemed like on your last slide, you had a couple of contractors.
Yeah, I don't know where everyone lives who's on the webinar, so I'm going to defer to you with local installers. But yes, you should be able to find a professional to help you with this.
We have a contractor directory on our website that is super rad. It includes contractors to do all sorts of things. And I believe we have some contractors who do rainwater harvest. So I will confirm that our directory has that in there, and also include that in the follow-up email. Um, okay. Can you talk a little bit about low flow irrigation from a tank? What special equipment is needed? Can a typical drip hose be used?
Yeah, so some emitters need a certain pressure to operate. There's like I don't know like the engineering of it, but I just know some do and some don't. So you want to look for drip irrigation that can operate on zero or low pressure. There's a handful of options. A soaker hose, not sure if you're referring to a soaker hose, but that might work for a while. Those are really prone to clogging, so you might have some clogging issues if there's any debris in your tank. But yeah, just go to the irrigation store and say, I want to put this in with my rain tank. I want to use low pressure. You can use like just the 1/4 inch outlets if you're going to specific plants. You can have little tiny, 1/4 inch openings going to it, and that works really easily. In my system, I have some specialized like low flow tubing, it's like inline emitters, and it does work. It's quite slow how much the water comes out. So if you're doing like individual plants, then going like to that plant would be, I think, more efficient.
Okay, we have quite a few questions, so we'll see if we can kind of like roll through these. A lot of people were asking about the hose and the low flow, so looks like I hope that touched on that for those other people. Okay. Are there any concerns? Do any concerns come about regarding roof treatments, such as zinc for moss or roofing materials, if you're going to use this to water your vegetable garden?
Yeah, so typically, if you're going to drink the water, you have to be much more, careful about all of this stuff. If it's just for irrigation, you have this, buffer. So with the kind of the worst roofs are the ones that have some kind of treatment. So they're often like wood roofs that are impregnated with like a fungicide or something. So those are like considered the worst. And yeah, I don't know, but I probably wouldn't go into my vegetable garden with that, knowing that there are metals coming off it. But all the other roofs, like even asphalt shingle, pretty much all of the other roofs are fine for irrigation.
Where would you look for a green tank?
Um, I, well, I actually, so it depends on the size. So if the tank I got it through a local installer because it was 3,000 gallons and it's really big and I needed a truck anyway to move it, which I don't have. So I went through his, where he gets his tanks. So kind of looking at, is someone going to help you with it? Go through their options. At my local feed store, they sell the big green tanks, which I could just go buy it, but then I can't get it home. So kind of look at the size. Is it something you can transport yourself? You can order them. Tank Depot is a place you can get tanks. Yeah, I've gotten tanks on Tank Depot before. They ship them. But if you get it locally, it'll be easier.
The shipping costs must be horrendous to ship one of those big things. So yeah, you
they're
find
really
a friend with a truck. What are your thoughts on solar water disinfection? Are there systems available here that are available in the UK? Also, do you know how long the metal catchment systems last versus the plastic ones? We prefer staying away from plastic. It's kind of a two-part question there. Let me know if you want me to repeat it.
So the first one is about drinking water treatment.
Yeah, solar water disinfection.
I don't know what that is per se. I mean, I generally know the concept. The drinking water, rainwater systems I've seen use, they use like carbon filters and then UV. That's the most common, but some people also just use those, I'm gonna forget what they're called, but they're like a ceramic, maybe a Berkey filter. They like sit on the counter and you pour the water through them. So I know people that drink rainwater that way, just, it's not coming through their plumbing, but it's, yeah. So any type of filter that's for drinking water should work, because rainwater is just water and you don't know if it's potable because it touched your roof. But whatever treatment you're using, as long as it's meant for drinking water, it should work with rainwater.
Well, yeah, it seems like maybe the UK is onto something with a certain system that does this well. So maybe someone
Yeah.
needs to go to the UK and come back and report to us.
Yeah, or maybe that person
Um,
could put like a link or something so we could see. That'd be great.
So we are at 7 o'clock. Do you want to speak quickly to the second part of this question that was about durability between a metal system and a plastic system?
Um,
Like how
yeah,
long one might last?
there's also ferro cement. So avoiding plastic is, really important for big picture, sustainability of materials. Like short-term practicality, it can be hard to get away from it, but there are ferro cement cisterns that can be affordable if you can find someone that knows how to do them, as well as the metal ones. Tucson has a lot, they use a lot of metal, like a metal culvert adapted into a cement thing. So if you look on the rainwater harvesting for drylands and beyond, there's more resources on metal tanks. It's much more common there. I haven't seen them much in the Pacific Northwest.
Thank you, everybody, for your thoughtful questions. There were a couple that we weren't able to get to, but as I mentioned earlier, Laura will be available via email to answer your questions. And so I will follow up with a bunch of resources and also Laura's contact information so you can reach out to her. We also have our urban conservation program. They are not rainwater catchment system experts like Laura is, but they do know a lot of things as well, and are always available to talk on the phone with you or maybe visit your property. So feel free to give us a call anytime as well. Laura, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for
We really
having me.
appreciate it.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.